here.
Yeah, there are.
And most South Africans are Litvaks. Although I think my antecedents were from Latvia rather than Lithuania, although it was a town fairly near the border, so exactly where the border was in those days, I don't know. In fact, I grew up in Kimberley in South Africa, and almost everybody in Kimberley came from the same little village, which was called Tulsi or Tukums. And for those of you who are South African, you will appreciate the bilingual joke, and that is they decided there was no future for them in Tukums. However, as I say, lots of Litvaks, and clearly we have somebody with Litvak connections here. He also has another connection with me that he doesn't know, because he went to Magdalen College, Oxford, which is where my daughter went, but a couple of years after him. And like members of my family, he became a lawyer, despite having done something respectable like a degree in history. However, he has pursued an interest in history subsequently, and that has led one way or another, as he will probably be able to tell us about, to his writing a book about the Jews of Lithuania, among other things. And thank you very much. Go ahead.
Well, thank you for your very kind introduction, and to you and to everyone at the New West End Synagogue for making this evening possible. It is a particular pleasure and honour to speak about my book in this community, because my late father, Michael says, was bar mitzvah here. So thank you all for coming. I'm often asked, why did I write this book? And the first answer is that I saw it as a kind of retirement activity. As has been said, I spent about 40 years of my life as a lawyer involved in corporate transactional legal work. I always knew that I would not be able to continue this much beyond the age of 60. It is very intense work, and many of the better English law firms discourage partners from continuing much beyond that age. But a second and perhaps more important reason for writing this book is that, like a lot of people as they grow older, I found myself asking the deeper question, where do I come from? And in common with many people of Lithuanian Jewish ancestry, I knew little about it. There were a number of reasons why I and other descendants of Lithuanian Jews knew relatively little. The generation of Jewish people who left Lithuania in the late 19th century, which in my case is my great-grandfather, tended not to talk much about their past. They regarded their past as poverty-stricken and filled with fear of violence against them. The First World War was a shattering experience for Lithuanian Jews, as most of the community was exiled almost from one day to the next, deep into Russia. The Holocaust largely destroyed the Lithuanian Jewish community. About 96% of the pre-war Jewish community was murdered, the highest proportion of Jews killed in any country. And in the post-war world, the fact that Lithuania was occupied by the Soviet Union until 1990 made it almost impossible to study that history dispassionately. So, in common with many people with Lithuanian Jewish ancestry, I found that I knew relatively little about that Lithuanian Jewish background. But my book is not family history. Indeed, it tries to do something which is perhaps slightly unusual. I take the outline of the experience of the paternal line of the family as a way of choosing the wider subjects to write about. My great-grandfather Meyer was born and brought up in what is now northern Lithuania, in a tiny village, a shtetl, which is called Pikeliai in Lithuanian and Pikeln in Yiddish. In the early 1890s, my great-grandfather moved from Pikeliai in northern Lithuania to Cork in southern Ireland, and in 1905 he and other family members moved again, but this time from Cork to Dublin. My grandfather, known as JD, trained as a doctor in Dublin, but unable to find work there, joined the British Navy before buying into a GP practice in New Cross in South London, where my father was brought up, before the family moved in the early post-war period to Blackheath in South London. In my book, I use this outline of the family experience as a way of looking at a number of questions concerning the modern history of Jews in Lithuania. Some of the questions are: why were there large numbers of Jews living in Lithuania in the late 19th century? What was their life like? Was it the kind of shtetl existence depicted in Fiddler on the Roof, or was it something rather different? Why did life become more difficult for Jews in late 19th century Lithuania? What happened to our Jewish people left behind in Lithuania during the First World War? How and why did the Holocaust happen in Lithuania? And how has Lithuanian government and society tried to come to terms with the Lithuanians' involvement in the Holocaust? In the time available today, I would like to try and say just a few things in response to those questions. So the first question is, why were there large numbers of Jews living in Lithuania in the late 19th century? Part of the answer is that medieval European society was often a very difficult place for Jews to live in. Jews were expelled from England in 1290, from France in 1306, from Hungary in 1360, from Austria in 1420 to 21, from Spain in 1492, and from Portugal in 1496. At different times, Jews were expelled from many of the German states. However, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which occupied a great swathe of Central and Eastern Europe in what is now Lithuania, Belarus, Ukraine, and Poland, was for many years a relatively safe and comfortable place for Jews to live, and many Jews found refuge there. In the first half of the 14th century, Grand Duke Gediminas encountered Jews while campaigning in Galicia and invited Jews to settle in what is now part of Lithuania. Gediminas's grandson, Vytautas, actively welcomed Jewish settlement, and it was during his rule that a Jewish community of some substance became established in Lithuania. In other words, the so-called Lithuanian Jewish Commonwealth was relatively welcoming to Jews. This may have been connected to the fact that for a long time Lithuania was pagan, not Christian. Indeed, Lithuania spent many years resisting German attempts to conquer and Christianize it during the so-called Northern Crusades, and it was the last European country to cease being pagan in the late 14th century. Jews had a very particular role in Lithuanian society. Much of the land was owned by Polish nobility, many of whom were absent. Ethnic Lithuanians tended to be poor and worked on the land. Jews occupied a middle position, often as suppliers of goods and services, and there was a kind of symbiotic relationship between Jews and Polish nobles. The nobles needed Jews to run their estates and make a success of the towns and villages established on their lands, and the nobles valued the revenues the Jews produced. In return, the nobles gave the Jews a measure of protection, and for many years the Jews enjoyed relative control over their own affairs in Lithuania. Travellers from the West who went to Eastern Europe in the late 18th century were struck by the number of Jews they saw and by how hard they worked. The relatively comfortable position of Jews in Lithuania was to change rather fundamentally with the so-called Third Partition of Poland in 1795. From that date, Lithuania came under Russian control, and Russia was run by Tsars who were highly autocratic, and many of them were not well disposed to Jews. From that time, Jewish life became more difficult. My second question is whether Jewish life in mid to late 19th century Lithuania was like that depicted in Fiddler on the Roof, or was it changing and modernising? I think there was change, and much of this was being brought about by the so-called Haskalah, the Jewish Enlightenment. The devotees of this movement were known as Maskilim. The aims of Haskalah were both to reform Jewish custom and also to reform the relationship between the Jewish world and Russian government and society. It sought the continued existence of a distinct Jewish community, but one which was updated and reformed, and which, it was hoped, would therefore have easier interaction with the surrounding society. It was in the nature of Haskalah that it could be taken up by individuals or small groups in remote communities. The process is described by Moses Lilienblum. He says, "I was weary and exhausted from studying the Talmud, its disputations and various absurdities. And when I heard of something new that was rational, I was drawn to it. Every Haskalah book I came upon, I devoured like the fruits of summer. Undiscriminating, I read everything that came into my hands." The fact that a few people were reading the books of the Haskalah in remote parts of Lithuania did have an influence. It affected the language that Jewish people used. The Maskilim encouraged the use of Russian as the language of the state and of German as the language of culture and science, rather than Yiddish. It also affected the clothes people wore, and it affected gender relations in that it encouraged men to be more active in mainstream economic activity. Traditional Jewish life in the shtetl was also being changed by the growth of the economy and improved transport systems. The development of the railways was particularly important because it connected remote parts of Lithuania to Baltic ports. I suggest in the book that perhaps one needs to think of the late 19th century shtetl not just as poverty-stricken, remote and stuck in its ways. At one level it was all of those things, but also as occupying a hinterland to thriving port cities. And these port cities gave access to a wider world of learning and commercial opportunity, which was transforming shtetl life rather quickly. The end of the 19th century saw a great wave of Jewish migration from Eastern Europe. In the roughly 3.5 decades between 1881 and 1914, about 2.7 million Jewish people migrated to the West from Eastern Europe, being about a quarter of the entire Jewish population of Eastern Europe. We know that about 75% of these Jewish people went to the US and to Canada. About 10% went to Palestine, as it then was. About 10% went to Latin America, and the rest went to other countries. Actually, Britain tends not to appear in migration figures because, in contrast to other destination countries, Britain was often seen as a place of transmigration. In other words, a place where many migrants stayed for a relatively short period before moving on somewhere else. The migration wave was set off by the assassination of Tsar Alexander II in 1881. This ended the modest liberalism of his regime. In some parts of the Russian Empire, there were pogroms, and many Jewish families have come to think that their forebears left Eastern Europe because they were fleeing pogroms. But actually, there were comparatively few pogroms in Lithuania in the late 19th century. Most of the pogroms of that time were further south. The reason why there were fewer pogroms in Lithuania is not entirely clear, but is probably connected to the outlook of Governor-General Tortleben of Vilnius, the Tsarist official with responsibility for maintenance of order in Lithuania. He seems to have thought that Jews were relatively sympathetic to Russian cultural influence in Lithuania and could be regarded as more reliable than Poles and Lithuanians. He also seems to have taken the view, rather straightforwardly, that his job was to maintain order. But if Jews did not flee because of pogroms as such, they may very well have fled because of the fear that pogroms would come to them. This intense fear is described in a letter of February 1882 sent by an unidentified Jew in Vilnius to a newspaper editor. He says, "We expected a pogrom during the Christmas holidays, and now our fears have not been allayed, and we expect a pogrom at any minute. If someone gets into an argument with a Christian, the latter immediately says, 'Just wait, soon we will settle all the scores.' What kind of life is this? If I had the courage, I would kill all those close to me and then myself. What a miserable creature is a Jew." Jews also fled Lithuania because of the extraordinary range of Tsarist laws which deliberately targeted them and which made their lives so difficult. In the 1880s, a commission was established by Tsarist authorities under Count Phelan to look into the Jewish question. It identified an astonishing 650 different laws which deliberately discriminated against Jews. These laws controlled where Jews could live and which areas of business they could be involved in. By the late 19th century, these laws had made their lives almost impossible. Many Jews seem to have emigrated because of fear of being conscripted into the Tsarist army. It's important to note that the worst time for Jews to be conscripted into the Tsarist army was earlier in the 19th century under Tsar Nicholas I, who ruled between 1825 and 1855. His regime used conscription as a way of trying to force Jews to be baptized. Under his rule, young Jewish men were usually conscripted for 25 years. The worst successes of the conscription system had ended by the late 19th century, but the idea of being conscripted was still traumatic. So, fear of pogroms, anti-Semitic legislation that made life almost impossible, fear of being conscripted into the Tsarist army, and the hope of improvement in their economic circumstances were all powerful reasons for leaving late 19th century Lithuania. But how to choose where to go? It seems that most people simply went to places where they already knew people, either family members or friends from their home communities. And this was the phenomenon of so-called chain migration. But why did anyone choose to go to Ireland? It was perhaps a surprising choice of emigration destination, given the terrible poverty, famine and sectarian conflict of late 19th century Ireland. In collective memory, the fact that Jews chose to emigrate to Ireland is often characterised as a result of trickery practised on them by ship's captains or of their own foolishness. Being an Irish Jew was therefore thought of as a kind of accident, albeit one that had a funny side to it and from which amusing anecdotes could be spun. These anecdotes take three main forms. The Jewish migrants were tricked into landing just outside Cork by dishonest ship's captains who had double-booked their onward passage to New York. The second kind of anecdote suggests the migrants disembarked thinking they were in the United States, having mistaken cries of Cork for New York, or Ireland for the Yiddish Ireland. And the third maintains that the ship's supply of kosher food had run out, and the strictly observant Jews preferred to stay in Ireland rather than starve or eat non-kosher food. The last of these stories is probably the one most based in reality. But, as well as accidental arrival, there were undoubtedly Jews who deliberately chose to go to Ireland. Many of the Jewish migrants travelled through northern English cities such as Manchester and Liverpool on their migratory journey, and they found those cities grey and dirty. They were more attracted by the green and wide open spaces of Ireland, which reminded them of home in Lithuania. Also, most of the immigrants first tried to earn a living as peddlers. Peddling involved carrying goods on their back from door to door and selling them, usually on credit, to Irish housewives. It was important for a peddler not to have too many other Jewish peddlers in the area because they were competition. Ironically, the fact that there were few other Jews in Ireland was precisely what made it attractive to those who did go there. The next question I look at in the book is what happened to Jewish people who stayed behind in Lithuania during the First World War. When we think of the First World War, I think many of us think of the long war of attrition in the trenches on the Western Front. But the experience on the Eastern Front, the war between Germany and Russia, was very different. Here, in 1914 to 1915, German armies enjoyed a record of almost unbroken success. For much of 1914 to 1915, Lithuania was on the front line of the war between Germany and Russia. Being on or near the front line made life difficult for Lithuanian Jews. Industrial plants were relocated to the Russian interior, depriving many Lithuanian Jewish workers of their livelihood. And many Jews were ruined when their homes or places of work were damaged in battle. Generally speaking, Lithuanian Jews seem to have responded to the outbreak of war with displays of patriotic allegiance to Russia. Something between 350,000 and 400,000 Jews served in the Russian army. However, Russian military setbacks were embarrassing, and the Russians needed a scapegoat. Jews were accused of spying. Perhaps the closeness of the German and Yiddish languages gave some plausibility to these accusations. By May 1915, about 75 to 80% of the Jewish population of Lithuania had been expelled. Generally, the Jewish population was given less than 24 hours to leave. In a speech in the Russian parliament to the non-Jewish deputy Zubinski said that as a representative of our 56th Siberian Division, I was myself on the scene and can testify with what incredible cruelty the expulsion took place. The whole population was driven out within a few hours during the night. At 11 o'clock, the people were informed they had to leave, with a threat that anyone found at daybreak would be hanged. Old men, invalids and paralytics had to be carried on people's arms because there were no vehicles. The Jews expelled from Lithuania were scattered across a wide area of the interior of Russia. It caused great hardship to the people expelled, but, and rather ironically, it brought a de facto end to the Pale of Settlement because it scattered Jews across a vast expanse deep inside Russia. This mass expulsion changed Jewish life in Lithuania in a way that it never really recovered from. We know that in Pikeliai, the small shtetl that my great-grandfather Meyer came from, the total population in 1897 was 1,758, of whom 1,206 were Jewish. In other words, 68% of the population of that time was Jewish. The expulsions of May 1915 removed all Jews from Pikeliai, and although a small handful returned post-war, the blow inflicted on that community by the expulsions of World War I was one that it never really recovered from. The Jews who returned to Lithuania after the First World War tended not to go back to the smaller towns where their homes and stores had been looted and destroyed. They headed instead for the larger towns, particularly for Kaunas or Kovno. Many had great difficulties getting back to Lithuania and were caught up in the violence and pogroms which followed the First World War. In my book, I say something about Jewish life in Lithuania during the interwar period and how, in the early post-war years, there was a short period of optimism that Jewish life would improve before storm clouds gathered and the picture darkened. I'm not going to say a lot about the Holocaust today. I do discuss it in detail in the book. I'll just make a few big picture points. The first point is to say that the way the Holocaust unfolded in Lithuania was rather distinctive. It was the first country in which the Nazis pursued the policy of killing the entire Jewish population, and this objective was largely achieved. It is estimated that about 96% of the pre-war Jewish population of Lithuania was murdered. The killing was mainly carried out by shooting and not by gas van or by gas chamber, and most of the shooting was carried out by local Lithuanians, albeit this was often, but not always, under the direction of Germans. The usual pattern was for Jews to be taken to pits on the edge of towns near where they lived. They were forced to dig the pits, and then local Lithuanians shot them and buried the bodies. It's also worth saying that the Holocaust in Lithuania went through at least 3 rather distinct phases. The first phase lasted from the German invasion of June 1941 until December 1941. And this was a period of mass murder of Lithuanian Jews. About 80% of them were murdered in this period. The second period lasted from January 1942 until March 1943, and can be thought of as a relatively quiet period during which German policy concentrated on exploiting Jews for their labour, having first enclosed them in ghettos in Vilnius, Kaunas and elsewhere. The third period began in April 1943 and lasted until July 1944. And this was a period characterised by the gradual liquidation of the existing ghettos and of the surviving Jewish population, by a mixture of murder and deportation to camps in Germany. There has been a huge amount of historical research and writing about why many Germans were so attracted to Nazism and became viciously anti-Semitic. I discuss that in the book. Rather less has been said about why significant numbers of Lithuanians engaged in this murderous assault on their Jewish neighbours. It's complicated. Partly it is to do with the development of Lithuanian nationalism in the interwar period, and with long-standing anti-Semitic sentiments with deep roots in Christian theology. Part of it, I think, is to do with the anti-Jewish fury which many Lithuanians felt and which arose from the trauma which Lithuania experienced as a result of being occupied by the Soviet Union for about 1 year between June 1940 and June 1941. Many Lithuanians were furious with Jews because they thought Jews had given the Soviets a very warm welcome when the Soviets arrived in Lithuania in June 1940. They also thought Jews had been too active in Soviet administration of Lithuania. Neither of these beliefs contained much truth. Most Lithuanian Jews were emphatically not communist. As to Jewish involvement in administering Soviet Lithuania, the best estimate is that about 12 to 16% of the Communist Party in Lithuania were Jews. This was very modest overrepresentation, but perhaps unsurprising given that Jews were, generally speaking, better educated than ethnic Lithuanians. The anger Lithuanians felt towards Jews may be connected to Lithuanians' trauma, which derived from the fact that Lithuanians did not put up any resistance to Soviet occupation in June 1940. It seems part of the reason for Lithuanians' assault on Jews was the desire to steal their possessions. Many memoirs by Jewish survivors contain graphic descriptions of local people stealing the possessions of their Jewish neighbours. I'm just going to read you a little extract from my book at this point. It seems that theft of Jewish possessions took place all across Lithuania, and everything of value owned by Jews was considered to be a legitimate target for plunder. The testimonies given by survivors to Leib Koniuszowski shortly after the war indicate how commonplace theft was in most provincial communities. In Anniksky, for example, Motnul Kuritsky said, with tears in their eyes, the Jews saw neighbours happily dragging away all their possessions before the Jews had even left the town. Their homes had been stripped bare. In Gidrakiai, Yisrael Katz said, Jewish possessions were continuously robbed. The partisans used to enter Jewish homes and take whatever they liked. In Turmantas, Mendel Davidson said, using coaches, the partisans took for themselves all the goods and property from the Jewish homes. Others transferred them to the countryside, and what was left was robbed by the townlet residents. Some members of my wider family were killed in Lithuania during the war. One member of the family survived. Like most of the small handful of those Lithuanian Jews who did survive, she was transferred to the camp at Stutthof, just outside Danzig, towards the end of the war. She was forced to participate in the so-called death marches that were inflicted on many camp inmates at the very end of the war, as the Germans tried to move concentration camp survivors away from the advancing Allied armies. Organisation and discipline broke down, and many of the death marches were seemingly purposeless, with camp inmates just walking round and round in ever smaller circles. These death marches were terrible for those who participated in them. It is thought that of the 750,000 prisoners in the whole concentration camp system at the beginning of 1945, approximately one-third died on death marches. By the end of the war, the overwhelming majority of the Jewish population of Lithuania had been murdered. How did any Lithuanian Jews survive? Some did so by hiding in so-called malines, being hiding places under houses or in sewers. A very few had survived by fleeing to the woods and joining the partisans. Most of those who survived had fled east into the Soviet Union immediately before the Nazi invasion. For those who returned to their former homes at war's end, the silence, loss and desolation was overwhelming. Chaim Grade describes returning to Vilnius. All that is left is walls, roofs, pillars, cornices, tottering beams. All that is left is broken bedsteads, the rusty entrails of Primus stoves, twisted forks, knives, spoons without the mouths. And I am left with eyes without tears. I cannot squeeze even a single tear from my eyes. An entire row of shops shuttered and bolted. Open up, you brigand, open up! No one laughs, and no one coughs, and no one answers. The final chapter of my book considers how Lithuanian government and society has tried or not tried to come to terms with the Holocaust in Lithuania. The important political background is that at the end of the Second World War, Lithuania was occupied by the Soviet Union. The Western Allies agreed, although not publicly, that post-war Lithuania should be in the Soviet sphere of influence. Lithuanians conducted a sporadic partisan war against the Soviets until about 1953. The Soviets sought to impose Soviet communism on Lithuania and ruthlessly to suppress dissent. They deported many Lithuanians to Siberia. There has been a reluctance or failure in many parts of post-war Lithuanian society fully to come to terms with the magnitude of the horror visited on its Jewish population. I think a number of things account for this. First of all, the Soviet government and Lithuanian governments during the period of Soviet occupation from 1945 to 1990 tended not to acknowledge the uniqueness of the tragedy of European Jewry and obscured the fact that Jews were killed because they were Jews. The Soviet regime described Jewish victims simply as Soviet people, and the killers were not characterized as Lithuanians, but as products of socio-economic classes that were enemies of the proletariat. This was confusing for much of the Lithuanian population. Secondly, I think many Lithuanians became very caught up with an understandable sense of their own suffering during the period of post-war Soviet domination. In the post-war period, many Lithuanians were deported to Siberia and to the gulags. The best estimate is that between 120,000 and 150,000 Lithuanians were deported. This seems to have made it difficult for many Lithuanians to find space fully to reflect on the fate of their former Jewish neighbours. In 1990, Lithuania became independent. The question of how to deal with the Holocaust quickly became relevant in the context of Lithuania seeking admission to the EU and to NATO, both of which eventually happened in 2004. In that context, a number of matters relating to the Holocaust needed to be addressed, including There needed to be an acknowledgement of guilt for Holocaust crimes and issue of an apology. The victims needed to be appropriately commemorated. Criminal proceedings needed to be brought against perpetrators. The local population needed to be properly educated about the Holocaust. And there needed to be restitution of stolen property. However, the question of whether Lithuanian government and society have adequately tried to come to terms with the Holocaust in Lithuania remains highly controversial. There are descendants of Lithuanian Jews who are concerned, and some of whom are angry, about a number of things, including that many of the memorials put up in the Soviet era do not refer to the fact that the victims being memorialized were Jewish, and are silent about the fact that their killers were Lithuanian. That some statues and plaques commemorating the Lithuanians who were responsible for Holocaust atrocities remain in place. Although, of course, it should be said that the thinking behind erecting these memorials was to celebrate Lithuanians' efforts to resist the Soviets and not their activities against Jews. That many of the mass graves of the Jewish victims are in a state of neglect. That the smaller regional museums across Lithuania have little material about the Jews who lived in those communities for many centuries. And, of course, some Jewish survivors and their descendants remain angry at the extraordinary wholesale theft of Jewish possessions. I think some of those who are very angry are angry both because of the horror itself, but also because the failure properly to come to terms with what happened is thought to represent a continuing slight to the Jewish community. There is an interesting question about whether any useful purpose is really served by trying to persuade the Lithuanian government and its people to become better informed about Lithuania's Holocaust history and to show more remorse. Advocates of such an approach tend to say that doing so would help ease trauma, both Lithuanian and Jewish, and also that education about the Holocaust would perhaps make it less likely that a comparable event could ever be repeated. Clearly, there are fine intentions and a good deal of idealism behind such thinking, but whether it is right is unknowable. I'd like to finish by reading you an extract from the conclusion to my book. In the book, I do say that the history of Jews in Lithuania is extraordinarily bleak, and I ask the question of whether any rays of light do shine through a story that is so bleak. One ray of light is to emphasize that for many years, Lithuania was a good place for Jews to live. In the early modern period, Jews were expelled from many Western European countries, as I have said, but they found refuge in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And for some centuries, Jews enjoyed considerable autonomy in Lithuania. It became a great centre for Jewish culture and learning. Another ray of light is that some of the thinking which most sustained hostility to Jews before the Holocaust has changed. It is significant, I think, that in Nostra Aetate, issued by Pope Paul VI in 1965, the Catholic Church formally absolved Jews from continuing responsibility for the death of Jesus. It says, what happened in his passion cannot be charged against all the Jews without distinction then alive, nor against the Jews of today. Perhaps a final ray of light is to reflect on the lives of some of the Jews who left Lithuania to make lives elsewhere. They carried with them the traditions and approaches to life and learning acquired either by them or their forebears in Lithuania. They achieved success in various walks of life, including as politicians, writers, musicians, and scientists. They moved to many different countries in the West, including the United States, South Africa, and England. Some, including members of my family, even moved to Ireland and flourished there. But the story of Lithuanian Jews in Ireland, a remarkable, relatively little-known story, is going to be the subject of my next volume. If you find this subject interesting, please do buy my book. My wife, Yvonne, is kindly going to be in charge of sales of the book after the talk, and the book is also available for purchase on Amazon and in all good bookshops. And I'll be very happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Do you want to answer questions for?
Well, for as long as you like, I don't mind.
Well, we'll keep it relatively short. Okay. You want me to? You go ahead and pick me.
Can you remind me that number you mentioned in terms of absolute recap? Can you please repeat that A was period in the 19th century when there was that biggest migration away from Lithuania, and what percent of the population, how many Jews were there and how many left, and percentage?
Well, the great period of migration from Eastern Europe to the West was really between 1881, and it was set off by the assassination of Tsar Alexander II in that year, because he was at times a comparatively liberal Tsar. He wasn't always liberal, but comparatively liberal. And at that time, it was possible for Jewish people to get into many of the European countries and into America without a passport. You did need a passport to get out of Lithuania. You needed a Russian passport to get out, which was actually quite difficult to get. But you did not need a passport to get into America or to Britain, or indeed to South Africa. So the great period of migration was between 1881 and the First World War in 1914. And in that period of time, I think about 2.7 million Jews left, being about a quarter of the entire population of Eastern Europe at that time.
2.7 million Jews left?
Yeah.
And what percentage of Jews was that?
Well, it was about a quarter of all the Jews living in Eastern Europe.
10 million Jews then? Really?
At that time, yeah.
And you said it was before 1880 that they had the 25-year conscription?
Yes, the period of conscription was in the early 19th century, yeah. And it was a period of about 25 years, and as I say, and the basic purpose of it was to try to compel Jews to be baptized. What happened was that young Jewish boys, often aged 10 upwards to their early teens, were forcibly taken away, often to remote places in deep Russia, and forced to be baptized. Some resisted, but then when they came home many years later, they had been so fundamentally changed by their experience that they were generally not accepted back into their families, and it was a very difficult experience.
Thanks. I just want to make one quick personal point and ask you a couple of things you can't respond to. First of all, it's interesting what you said about your family's refusal to acknowledge or to be interested in the past. When my parents left Galicia after the war, my father refused to speak Polish and refused to let me learn any words. And I noticed that a few decades afterwards, when he did speak Polish again to somebody, he was very poor. That's just that thing. But now, your point about the suffering of the Jews in the First World War, German war there, the non-Jews must have suffered as well, no? Equally, not just the Jews. And finally, about the Lithuanians, I think, and their persecution of Jews, I think they were extra enthusiastic amongst Eastern European people, and they had loads of volunteers in the death camps in Auschwitz, and I think that's right. And connected with that was that before the Germans arrived in Kaunas, Lithuanians started rounding up Jews and killing them. Is that correct? As I understood it, because I went there and I saw the place where they were rounded up.
Yeah. Well, thank you for those questions. So your first point was about the fact that it was quite common, I think, in the Jewish world for people who left Eastern Europe not to want to talk about their past or to look back. And as you say, I think that was a very common phenomenon, not only in my family but more widely. I since I wrote the book, I've talk to many people that have some Lithuanian Jewish ancestry, and I find generally that people don't know much about this history. They know that some part of their family came from Lithuania, but they know, I would say, extraordinarily little really about that past, and they know so little because their family didn't talk to them about it. And I think they didn't talk about it because the past was often pretty terrible, and the coping mechanism, if you like, was to look to the future and try and make the best of the future and not to look back and dwell upon difficult things in the past, which is understandable, in my opinion.
I didn't have that, or my grandparents, but anyway.
Okay. You then made a point about the fact that there would have been non-Jews in Lithuania who, during the First World War, also suffered. Well, absolutely, I'm sure that's right. But the particular point about what happened to the Jews is that they were sent into exile. They were, as I said, something over 75% of the Jewish population of Lithuania was exiled from one day to the next. 15th of May 1915, they were forced out of Lithuania and sent to all sorts of very remote places, sort of deep inside Russia, which were, the journey to those places was traumatic and difficult. When they arrived at those places, they were often half-starved. They were very dependent upon the local Jewish community in those places helping them. Sometimes there were people to help them, sometimes there weren't. And as I say, in the period after the First World War, many of these people tried to come back to Lithuania, but it was very difficult to do so because the First World War, as we know, ended in 1918, but for a couple of years after the end of the First World War, there was great conflict right the way across Central and Eastern Europe. The war between Poland and Russia, and there were pogroms right the way across what would now be Poland and Ukraine. And Jewish people who had been exiled from Lithuania often got caught up in these pogroms. And in the period immediately post First World War, Vilnius was not a part of Lithuania, it was a part of Poland, and relations between Poland and Lithuania were very tense. So quite a lot of Jewish people went back to Vilnius, but they were not really able to communicate properly with their Jewish friends and neighbours who were in Lithuania, because communication between Poland and Lithuania was virtually impossible. It was also, as I said, very difficult for Jewish people to go back to the shtetls that they had been in before the First World War, because their property had been looted, and I think they were unwelcome in those places, and there wasn't much for them to do there. So, as I said, I think a lot of Jewish people did go back to Kaunas, to Kovno, and in the interwar period, briefly, Kovno developed reasonably quickly and became a place of some interest. It was quite interesting. Modernist architecture there, some great composers visited there. It sort of got onto the map. It was a place of interest for a few years in the interwar period.
Sorry, just what was the size of the population that got forcibly sent into exile in May 1915?
That's a good question. It would have. I think it was. I don't know exactly, but something between about 150 and 200,000 people. It was that sort of order. Well, the population was about 150 to 200,000 people. Yeah.
And was there a secular Jewish population at all, or was it all religious?
Well, as I said, I think the sort of before the First World War, the population of Lithuania had been affected by the Haskalah, this kind of Jewish enlightenment, and there was an interest in enthusiasm for reading rational books, secular books. It's difficult to say quite how widespread that was, but it was certainly quite popular, and a lot of the sort of secular political movements were popular too. I mean, the Bund, the Jewish left-wing movement was popular, and I think other kinds of socialism were also quite popular. But nonetheless, the overwhelming majority of the population would, certainly by today's standards, be very religious, very observant. But I think it's worth saying that the sort of Lithuanian Jewish approach was quite distinct from that of kind of Polish Jews. I think in Lithuania, the Litvaks had a very rational approach to religious study. It was a kind of very particular, text-based approach, great emphasis placed on individuals, particular thinking, and there was a tremendous appreciation, a tremendous reverence for learning and for scholarship. This was the thing that really mattered to Litvaks. And one of the things that I've been wrestling with in writing my second book about the history of Jews of Lithuania is how it actually was that the first generation of migrants could be peddlers, and within a very few years their children were all doctors and lawyers and so on. And I think the answer to that really is that the thing that really motivated even the first generation was learning. They had a great love of learning, fascination for learning, and peddling was not something you had to do during the day to earn a living. But it was really all about study and learning. That was the thing that was deeply revered in the Litvak community.
The Soviet Union put out the war in 1917, not 18. The war ended in 17.
Which war?
First World War.
Yeah, but they kept fighting to 1920, 21, 22. There was war all the time there. The Poles were fighting the Russians were fighting...
True, but
the partisans in the Ukraine and so on. There was a constant war.
That's right.
Yeah, sure. It's pretty clear why the Jews ended up in Poland came to Commonwealth. They were something like 10 million. It was the biggest population in Europe. And they ended up there because the Commonwealth was one of only two places in Europe where Jews could legally live. The other were the Papal States. But the question that I want to ask is, how did they get to the Commonwealth? Did they go through Northern Europe and across Germany, or did they go through Italy to the Ottoman Empire and then up to the Balkans? Or was it a combination of the two?
Well, I think Jews migrated to the Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth over a period of time, over many centuries actually, and how people went there would have varied, from person to person and over time. I think that there are clearly a number of Baltic ports, and I think a lot of people would have gone into those, went into Riga, into Libau, into Klaipėda, as it was called. And I think a lot of people would simply have made their own way by land.
Because the Sultan actually took a lot of Jews out of Spain, and brought them into Turkey, into the Ottoman Empire. So I'm wondering how many of Polish and Lithuanian Jews came out that way. Have you been able to figure that out?
Well, I don't know. I think that sort of probably most of the Lithuanian Jews came from German lands originally, and the different German states, as I said, expelled Jews at different times in the medieval and early modern period, and I think over a period of some centuries, many Jews moved from Central Europe, from German states into Lithuania.
Were any of them descendants of the Khazars?
Yes.
No way to know that for sure, but I'm asking you to speculate.
Well, I think probably a few were. I don't really know the answer to that, to be clear, but I think most of them probably not. I think most of them were descendants of Jews who had lived in the German states, in particular. I think many of them, moved eastwards because of the expulsions from German states over a period of many centuries. But I think it would be too too simplistic to say that there was a particular time when the Lithuanian Jews went to Lithuania, or particular reason for their doing so. I think they sort of moved there gradually over a number of centuries, actually.
Jews tended to be expelled from the German state because of the Black Death. Jews were blamed for the Black Death, and they were then expelled from the various different states. And they went to Lithuania at that time. It was a huge country. It stretched from the Baltic right down to the Black Sea. I mean, it was much bigger than it is today. It was an enormous empire. And they were welcomed. The Lithuanians at that time welcomed the Jews.
Yeah.
They were very,
Absolutely.
very welcome. My mother actually went back to Lithuania in the 1920s to visit some of her relatives there, and conditions weren't particularly bad. I mean, the villages didn't have paved streets; they were mud streets. It was a bit like the Wild West. It wasn't back into the Wild West, really, but they were impoverished, but not. They were. The existence was bearable. It was sort of.
Yeah, well, that's interesting. I think in the interwar period, things were not too bad, particularly in the early interwar period. I think between the end of the First World War and 1926, conditions were reasonably good for Jews. There was a hope at the end of the First World War that Jews would be granted autonomy. But then in 1926, there was a much more nationalist, right-wing Lithuanian government which deprived Jews of autonomy, and I think from then on things became quite difficult again.
I'm particularly interested in what the situation is today.
Yeah.
I was very much struck by your comment that something like 96% of the Lithuanian Jewish population was murdered, sometimes under the supervision, as you said, of the Germans, sometimes with the Lithuanians themselves doing it. Under those circumstances, what's the position today? Do any Jews go back to Lithuania? That's the first question. And second question is, what is the position of the Lithuanian government about the past?
Okay. Just make a note of your two questions. Well, your first question is, do any Jews go back to Lithuania today? I mean, as I said, about 96% of the pre-war Lithuanian Jewish community was murdered, mainly by Lithuanians. After the war, there were some survivors who went back to Lithuania for a bit, but most of those people found it unbearable to be there because their families had been murdered, their lives had ended there, and there was no reason to stay. It was miserable, and so they did not stay. I mean, a very small handful of people stayed. In my book, I have a chapter about the memoir of a remarkable woman called Rivka, who did witness the Holocaust in Lithuania, survived, and did stay there in the post-war period, and describes what that was like. She stayed, I think, mainly because she felt she had an absolute duty to try and put the mass graves into some kind of order, and to do whatever she could to bring to justice the people who had been involved in perpetrating the horrors. But she describes, for example, walking down the street and seeing Lithuanians who she'd known all her life ignore her, and these people would be wearing clothes that had belonged to her family. So it was pretty horrific. So very few members of the pre-war Lithuanian Jewish community went back to Lithuania. The Jewish population of Lithuania today is about 4,000 or 5,000 people. But most of those people are people who were a part of the Soviet administration in the post-war period, people who worked in the bureaucracy of the Soviet regime. So in other words, not people that had a long-term connection with Lithuania. You ask about the position of the Lithuanian government. Well, I think a lot of Jewish people feel that the Lithuanian government has not done as much as it could and should to bring Holocaust perpetrators to justice. In fact, almost none of them have been brought to justice. There are still statues standing in Lithuania of Lithuanians who were involved in the perpetration of atrocities against Jews during the war. There were I think about 240 mass graves across Lithuania of Jews, and many of them are in quite a bad condition. They are becoming better, but they're still in quite a bad condition. So the Lithuanian government has not done a very good job, I think it would be fair to say. Having said that, I think they are trying to send encouraging signals. I mean, I don't mind saying I've given a talk at JW3 which was hosted by the Lithuanian ambassador, and a number of officials from the Lithuanian embassy were at that talk. And outwardly they're very courteous, very keen to explore this sort of shared history of Lithuanians and Jews in Lithuania, and very keen, so they say, to ensure that young Lithuanians today are properly educated about what happened. Having said that, I have to say that many of the young Lithuanians that I have met in the course of writing this book know staggeringly little about the history of Jews in Lithuania. I mean, I can tell you that one of the ways in which I wrote this book was that at the time of writing it, my second daughter was actually doing a PhD in Oxford and sharing a house with a young Lithuanian girl whose parents are medics in Vilnius, so highly educated Lithuanian person doing a PhD in Oxford, and she was very helpful in translating various things from Lithuanian to English for me. But she knew nothing about the Jewish history in Lithuania, absolutely nothing about it at all. And I have found in the various talks that I have given, there have been some Lithuanians in the audience who afterwards have come up to me and told me that they knew really nothing about it. And I've also had the experience actually being approached by one or two people who thought they were Lithuanians, have done DNA tests, found that they have got substantial Jewish background in their DNA, and this has been, I think, really traumatic for those people. They suddenly discovered that they're half Jewish or a quarter Jewish, and they didn't know that, and they also didn't know what Lithuanians had done to Jews. And those two things together have, in the case of a few people I have met in the course of giving talks about this book, I mean, it's clearly been very traumatic for those people.
Can you get the Lithuanian government to translate that into Lithuanian?
Well, that's a good question. I don't know. I haven't tried that. Yeah.
Were any other ethnic groups or nationalities or religious groups caught up in the same way?
Well, not in the same way the Jews were, but there were a number of different ethnic groups living in Lithuania for much of the early modern and modern period. There were communities of ethnic Germans, particularly living in the port cities. In Latvia, I mean, Riga is a very German-influenced town, and Libau or Lipaia also has quite a lot of ethnic Germans. Actually, most of the ethnic Germans fled Lithuania immediately before the German invasion in June 1941. They were encouraged by Germany and by Germans to leave Lithuania and go to Germany. That's what they did. But historically, there have been communities mainly on the coast of Germans. There have also been communities of Poles. The Poles tended to be landlords
sometimes absent, but big sort of Polish noble landlords. There were communities of ethnic Russians as well. So Jews were by no means the only ethnic minority, but they were the ethnic minority that was most involved in sort of trading activity and middleman activities.
Nick, you've been talking for a long time. You need a break. Should we take 2 more questions?
Yeah,
Sure. Good evening.
I just wanted to ask, following on from that gentleman's question about Lithuania today, when we opened the Holocaust and Genocide Centre in Johannesburg, Father Dubois came and opened it, and obviously spoke about the work he's doing in the mass graves in East Europe. And I just wondered if you had been in contact with him and spoken to him, because he's probably single-handedly kind of bringing out evidence of the mass killings.
Well, I don't know him personally, but he actually wrote a book called The Holocaust by Bullets, or about the Holocaust by Bullets, and I have certainly read his book, and I think it's a very interesting and important book, because until he wrote that book, I think, shall we say, the Jewish population at large in this country, when they think of the Holocaust, they think of Auschwitz, they think of gas chambers and gas vans, whereas actually in the early years of the Holocaust, particularly in the Baltics, I mean, the Holocaust was not about gas, it was about shooting, and the people that did the shooting were the local Lithuanians, and I think he has brought that to a much wider audience, and that's very important work. And I think in doing that, he's also been a part of a movement of many historians of the Holocaust to ensure that people understand that the Holocaust was not sort of just a German crime, and it couldn't have happened without the collaboration of Europeans in many countries. I mean, in Lithuania, it is said that there were about 40 or 50 communities where the Jews were shot by local Lithuanians before the Germans arrived. I mean, just before the Germans arrived, a day or two before, but just before the Germans arrived, in anticipation of the German arrival. So it wasn't as though Germans were saying, you do it. They, off their own bat, in anticipation of the German arrival, they murdered their Jewish communities.
You mentioned that it was mainly German, the Jews from Germany who came to Lithuania. At the end of the 15th century, is there any evidence that there was a big exodus from Spain and Portugal towards Lithuania?
I don't think that many of the Jews who left Spain and Portugal went to Lithuania. I mean, I think most of those people, didn't they, went to Mediterranean countries, to North Africa, to Italy, to Turkey, the Eastern Mediterranean. I mean, Lithuania was an Ashkenazi Jewish world. It was not a Sephardi Jewish world. So I think, it may have been that a handful did say, but generally speaking, Jews expelled from Spain and Portugal went, of course, to the New World, but also to North Africa, to the Mediterranean, to Turkey, to the Ottoman Turkish world, but by and large not to Lithuania. So that's a question here.
Okay,
Or should we?
one more question.
Okay.
But make it a question, Doris.
Yes, if you can comment about Germany encouraging the ethnic Germans to leave Lithuania before the invasion. But that, I thought that it was the presence of the ethnic Germans in all these Eastern European countries is one of one of the excuses to occupy all these places. So why do you come to the conclusion, or what's the basis for your saying what you did?
Well, I think that clearly a part of, I should say, medium to long-term German policy was Lebensraum. They wanted to colonise the Baltic states and to plant them with ethnic Germans. I mean, that was clearly the medium-term objective. But nonetheless, in the period of the invasion itself, I think the that Nazi Germany did not want their battle against the local population to be, should we say, confused by the presence of there being ethnic Germans around, and the Nazi regime strongly encouraged ethnic Germans to leave Lithuania in the period shortly before their invasion, and most of them did so and went to one or two places in North Germany and sort of waited for the Germans to conquer Lithuania before going back.
One of the starkest things that I got out of your talk this evening.
No, that's the last question.
Should we have one final question?
One of the starkest things that I got from your talk tonight was when the Soviets took over in Lithuania. They talked about the killing of the Jews, but they don't mention Jews as such. This is very much, I think, what I perceive the BBC is doing today. Do you see any lessons to be learned from this?
Well, I mean, I suppose that's a much wider question that sort of leads into much sort of bigger questions about anti-Semitism and what's going on. And I think, I don't cover this in the book, but I do look a bit. I do look at questions of what the deep roots of anti-Semitism are. Why, over so many centuries, has this been a continuing problem? And the answer, I think, is basically buried in Christian theology in various ways. I mean, first of all, there is this idea that Christianity had superseded Judaism. And it is obstinate and difficult for Jews not to understand that Christianity has superseded Judaism. So there's that. There's, secondly, this idea in some of the Gospels of an association between Jews and the devil. And then, thirdly, there is the idea that Jews were responsible for the killing of Jesus, and in perpetuity were responsible for that, which, I mean, given that Jesus was himself Jewish, lived in an entirely Jewish environment, and would, I suspect, hardly blame anybody that wasn't Jewish, and was actually condemned to death by the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate. I find it fairly extraordinary that billions of people across the world for millennia have believed that. So I think the sort of this deep theologically based antagonism to Jews then led to Jews being perceived as the other in Christian Europe for millennia, and that led to them having to live in certain places and being confined to certain occupations, and this thing of being othered meant that they were unpopular, and the particular the particular reason for disliking Jews changes and evolves, but I think this othering has it, in my opinion, has its sort of deep basis in Christian theology.
And of course, we know that Jesus was Jewish because he lived at home with his parents. He thought his mother was a virgin, and he thought his father was God. You know, what else could he be other than Jewish? Right.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much. I know people probably want to ask more questions, but you've been going for an hour and a quarter, and I think it's only fair to give you a bit of a rest now. Absolutely fascinating. I just want to say a couple of things. That it's easy, and it happened tonight, it's easy to dwell upon the later years of the Jews in Lithuania. The emigration in the last half of the 19th century, the interwar years, the Holocaust, and so on. But what is actually more interesting are the earlier years. The Jews coming into Poland and Lithuania, where they were the freest Jews in Europe. And as you mentioned, they worked closely with the landlords and the landowners who protected them from the peasants and the church. And there's a story of Casimir the Great, the king of Poland, king of the Commonwealth, who his mistress was supposed to be the most beautiful woman in Poland, and her name was Esther. and she interceded with him on behalf of the Jews. I think you can see the parallel there, right? And the other interesting story, which I won't tell you, but you've probably come across it doing the research, is the story of Saul Wall, the one and only Jewish king of Poland. And I won't say anything more about that now. So let's have a nice round of applause.